Hi, this is Gotti Elcon with Selig Film News. We're here with the director of The Guy with the Knife, Alison Armstrong. Alison, this is a bold film. It's dealing with a subject matter that has people battling over this subject matter. It's a tricky film to make. How did you first kind of come across the story? And I know you've been attached to it for a very long time. Tell us though how you first got started with this project.
I was working on some post-Katrina stories in Houston for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where I was producer. And I was introduced to someone named Ray Hill. And Ray first told me about a story of how he cracked a case that the Houston Police Department said they couldn't solve, and that resulted in the charges of murder against 10 kids from the Woodlands. And then he told me that he had become friends with them, but particularly with the kid who wielded the knife. And that was what started me off on the story.
You know, it's open. You even put it in your Kickstarter trailer. It starts with the fact that John does say, "I stabbed Paul." It starts with that, but the story goes so crazy, so wild. When did you start realizing that there's so much more underneath, and that you've got to really tackle this and maybe start touching people that might not want to talk about it, that might have never talked about it? And how did that process come about?
Well, I think just in the course of doing research for something that seemed like a simple murder case, you begin digging into the details, and as you drill down into a story, you realize that there are many elements to it, that you have to look at the historical roots of this particular case in Houston. And you have to look at how the police dealt with these issues. You have to look at how the churches and the schools dealt with gay people. So when you start looking at the societal prejudices that were extant at the time, you pretty quickly begin to realize that the story is more complex than that first meets the eye.
You know, it's interesting you bring up that the notions of the church and you know, a southern city like this happening, having someone from the outside come in and notice the story. I think a lot of us in Dallas that heard about the story immediately thought, okay, this is what happened. And I think obviously the same thing in Houston. Coming from an outside perspective, what made you dig deeper? What was it that made you think there's something not right here?
Well, I had the luck to be able to interview an excellent journalist from Houston who's since deceased, Susan Bardwell, and you'll see her tonight in the film. And Susan told me a great many details about the murder case that I hadn't previously known. She began by telling me that she'd met the kid who was incarcerated, and she felt that he was ready to get out of prison. And she felt that the sentence was too stiff to begin with. And this was from a pretty tough crime reporter. And for her to say that really made me think that I needed to sort of weigh in and, from an outsider's perspective, dig up some more details.
Since it was such a harsh sentence, 45 years, it was very much like a precedent. It was trying to make a point. And it wasn't necessarily based on what happened that night as much as it was, we have to do something about this issue. You're going to run into walls, I think, when you're digging deep into something where people are using this as the rationale for all the basis of the law and how to prosecute. How did you, running into those walls, how did you break through them? How did you get to these people? It seems like there might be some really tough hurdles, and it's not like the Texas legal system is known to just open its doors.
The Texas legal system didn't automatically open its doors, that's for sure. But I did manage to get an interview with John Bice, and that was the beginning of understanding that there was a lot more to the story. And I discovered, for instance, that John had no history of ever having gone to Montrose to do anything other than to spend time dancing in the clubs. And I found out that he wasn't homophobic, and that sort of changed, made me change the way I was looking at the story altogether.
What he's done since he's been in prison is pretty remarkable. Can you talk a bit about that and more about the type of person John is? I mean, to be put away for that amount of time, a lot of people would just give up, but he has not.
He hasn't. I've seen him age considerably, and I think that's the saddest thing to do. You can see that the marks of institutionalization are beginning to weigh on him. He's grown up in prison. His entire youth has been spent there. He's been in prison longer than he was ever free. But he has steadfastly stayed close to his goals of becoming an educated person, helping other people when he can, staying away from the gangs, staying away from the drugs in prison. He's pretty much of a straight edge, and I would have to say he's both a mature person and a philosophical person.
You know, the parole system is something I don't think a lot of people know how it happens or what. I mean, my history of it is watching Shawshank and some guy stamping something, and that's how I thought parole hearings happened. It's a different beast altogether. How did you tackle that side of it? Because people just don't know, A, how Texas does it, and maybe how other people do it in other states and other countries. What is it about this parole system that just seemed like, okay, we need to dig deeper, and why isn't he out now?
Well, the parole system is a secretive process, and I think you'll see that in the film tonight. That's the most troubling thing, I believe. I don't think most Texans know that the parole process is secret. And it has also become increasingly politicized. If people can write letters saying someone should not be granted parole, then politicians are going to listen to that because they care about counting votes. So that's extremely important. The parole board really ought to be an independent body, and it has a history of being independent in Texas. But it hasn't been, I think, since Ann Richardson's time. I think that's the issue here. The Canadian system is very open. When you come up for parole, you go before a board, and they have an opportunity to meet you and to assess not only what you've done in prison, but the likelihood of reoffending again. But there is no such process in place in Texas.
Yeah, with the changes that we've seen in John, it seems like he would be a shoo-in to be let out, but that's not what's happened. Tell us about that behind the scenes of learning about why maybe that didn't happen.
Well, here's the nub of the whole story. Nobody really knows why John has been denied parole, including his lawyers. His lawyers have never seen his parole file. John has never seen his parole file. So he doesn't know why he's being denied parole, and neither do his lawyers.
Is the impact of the media's presence in not just this case, but all similar types of cases, and like you said, since it's secret, maybe that influence does have more influence than anything else. If we were 50 years ago, how would this case been handled differently than the media frenzy that's backed this one? I mean, has that impacted what's happened and why he's not been released? I mean,
there's no question it's a media case. His lawyer told me that he has seen stamped on John's file, high-profile media case, or words to that effect. I think if he had not been so high-profile, he would have been out a long time ago. All the other 9 kids are out.
Yeah.
He's the last one left.
You know, it's so many cases where exoneration or these cases, it's always looked at, you've got to have evidence, DNA, but with this, and it being high media, it seems like you have to change the perception of the case and the people in it. How does this film do that? I mean, you do show us so much more than anyone ever knows about this case. You talk to more people than anyone ever has. Some people who've never talked have talked to you. Tell us about that part. I mean, you have more evidence and knowledge of this case than anyone else, I think.
I have done quite a bit of digging. I've had a lot of help, too. I hired a couple of times I hired private detectives to help me ferret out information as well. And that was a key part of getting the material. But I think one of the most troubling things about it was the fact that evidence was entered so late in the day into the case. And there was a perception of what happened that night that really doesn't quite square with what very likely happened. There's this image that John went down in a premeditated way because he hated gay people to hurt or kill someone who was gay, and that just wasn't the case. In fact, John did not know he had killed anyone until a day or two later.
You might anger people that see this film on both sides, on different sides. For a documentary filmmaker, that must be something you knew was going to happen, but did you realize that maybe you're opening up such it could become explosive if something does happen either way?
Well, I think that our job as filmmakers and journalists is not to be popular. That's not our job. Our job is to try to tell a story in as clear and honest a way as we possibly can, and I've endeavored to do that. the failures are mine too.
Mm. You know, James really wanted this film. He's pushed to bring it here to the film festival. What is it like being able to show it here in Texas? It's important that I think Texas audiences know all that you've gathered, but being able to show it here in the South in Dallas, what does that mean to you?
It means a lot to me. I am very honored to be here at the Dallas International Film Festival, and I was so hoping for a premiere of this film in Texas, so it means the world. I look forward to getting feedback, good, bad, indifferent, whatever it is.
Is there any questions you're fearful that will pop up, or things that maybe you're scared people will get angry, and maybe the dialogue won't be as open, I guess? Is there that fear, or maybe you want that to talk about it?
I hope people don't shout. I hope cool heads prevail. I hope people can look at this, maybe once the initial shock of knowing what has happened, looking at this evidence wears off, that they sit down and they really think about it. Because it's not enough to put people in jail for committing crimes. Society as a whole has a responsibility to prevent crime. And you best do that not by meting out harsh sentences. We know that doesn't work. You best do that by teaching the values that prevent it to begin with, in schools, in churches, synagogues, wherever.
You're going to have a lot of people that are close to the subject here tonight. Mm-hmm. Are you anxious? I mean, what are you feeling about that? I mean, people are going to see this for the very first time.
I think they know me well enough to know that I've given them ample opportunity to tell their story. And I hope they trust me enough to know that I have been as fair as possible and as even-handed as possible.
You know, I got to see, like you told me earlier, a bit of a rougher cut. What can I expect tonight? Because I'm excited to see the polished final version.
It is more polished. The visual material is much nicer now. It's been worked on by our wonderful visual designer, Ryan Hayes. We have a terrific sound studio in Toronto called Tattersall Sound, and they've done a marvelous job with the sound and with doing elements of the recreation. A very talented composer, Kevin Staples, who did the music for it, who's done music for a lot of, including Academy Award-nominated films. And then I have three remarkable editors who worked on the film. Ross Wilson, who worked with me for, I don't know, he's worked for ages on this. We pulled this out of the bog together, we like to say. And then veteran editor Sarah Petty, who came in. And then Ricardo Acosta. Sarah came in to help restructure the film, especially at the beginning. And Ricardo came in to help us cut and do all those difficult things that when you're too close to a project you just can't do. So I've had a remarkable team of people. And you also have to know that the Out Network, the gay network mm-hmm. in Canada, are the executive producers of this film.
Looking at, you're showing it here in Dallas, but you're going to be in Houston in very soon. Mm-hmm. What are your feelings about going to Houston to show it?
I'm excited to go to Houston. It will be important to discuss this with the LGBT community, extremely important to discuss this with that community. And I think that they are a progressive, intelligent, well-educated group, many of them, and I think they'll welcome the opportunity to know more about this crime and its aftermath. It's
a fascinating case. It's so great that you were able to tackle this, and thank you for bringing it to Dallas. I think audiences will be amazed at what they see, and hopefully it'll maybe cause some change or at least something to come from this. Thank you so much, Alison.
Thank you very much.
The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome. The Middle East is boiling, and who better to have on the show than A.M. Rosenthal? I'm sure everybody in the United States and the world reads his columns, And he's unabashedly against what's happening now, especially as concerns Mr. Arafat. He doesn't trust him. Everybody knows that A.M. Rosenthal was the managing editor of the New York Times for a number of years, and he doesn't hide the fact that he's Jewish. Welcome to the show, Abe.
That would be kind of difficult anyway. It's very good, incidentally, to have a name like Abraham. Not like it, but Abraham.
I'd be worried if you were Ishmael, you know? I'd be worried.
No, I mean, if you go up to somebody, you say, hello, I'm Abe Rosenthal, it means I'm a Jew. I mean, you know, that's it. It's not Milton or anything, or Leon. It's, you say, I'm a Jew. It's kind of interesting.
Sometimes Jews take a rap at the New York Times. They think it's anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-everything, and yet most of the editors there have been Jewish.
Well, it's hardly anti-Semitic. There people have, but among Jews and among staff people and so on, and non-Jews, there are different opinions about Israel. But I want to explain something, because a lot of people don't understand this. After I was managing editor, I was executive editor. It meant I was in charge of the whole paper, everything that went into it, all the news and the reporters who got hired, who didn't, and so on. The only exception was it had nothing to do with the editorial page and the op-ed, but the editorial page. There is a real division between, and it's a philosophic
As it should be.
division. So I was in charge of everything in the paper except the editorials. And I had nothing to do with them. I saw them when the reader saw them, and with many of them I disagreed, including many of those about Israel. But I did not express my opinions, except to people inside sometimes over lunch. But I stayed away from it. So therefore, if I, as the chief editor, executive editor, was totally non-political, that meant that the reporters on the staff and the other editors on the staff also should be non-political, and they didn't have to worry about what I felt about anything.
Did you get lobbied a lot from politicians as the managing editor?
Oh, sure, I got lobbied.
But they didn't know you didn't write the editorial policies. Executive, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Executive editor.
That's all right.
Who was the managing editor when you were there?
Well, Cy Topping was the managing editor. I was managing editor for a while. That was my title. And then I had the same work, another title. But Cy Topping and Arthur Gelb was the deputy managing editor, so on. But no, the Times, I do not believe that the Times is hardly anti-Semitic. I think that sometimes it gives the opinion, its editorials do not coincide with other people who are interested in India. Sorry, Israel. I spent 4 years in India, in Israel. But I do not feel that the editors, including the present editor, is of the editorial page, is hostile in any way, although I might not agree with his opinions.
Do you believe, as many people do, that the New York Times can really change policies in this country?
Yes, I do. I believe that it cannot do it because of power. I mean, we have no financial power to do that. We have enough financial power. We have that. And also, the strength of the Times, to tell the truth, and I'm glad to say it, is the people who read it. You read it. I think other people here read it. I think many of the people in this audience who will see this read it. And Teddy White, a long time ago, bless him, wonderful man, great political writer. One of his books he wrote, Making the President, 1960, 64, I forget, 60, that the great power of the New York Times is that when anybody from Boston to Washington picks up the phone to call anybody else from Boston to Washington, the unspoken assumption of the conversation is that they both started the morning by reading the New York Times, and that was a platform of their knowledge. Now it's a little wider than Boston, but it's the readers of the New York Times who believe that the Times is its news columns are non-political, who trust the New York Times, don't like it all the time, they're always arguing with it, so do I. But I think it's the readership of the New York Times that creates its influence.
How tough is it for a young person to get a job at the New York Times?
Tough.
A lot of applications?
Yes, a lot of applications, but we keep hiring people all the time. But fortunately, Times is a very greedy newspaper. I mean, it's greedy for talent, it's greedy for news. It really is, or has a big appetite for the news. It prints almost it has stories on every subject, you know, from archaeology to zoology and from Alaska to Zanzibar, you know, that kind. And it has an unending appetite for news and a great lust for talent. It's all I did, as present editors do.
So how would you get your talent, Abe, when you were the editor of it?
Well, when I used to be the editor, there were two ways. I used to grow it and steal it. And to a certain extent, that is, we took on young people. Present editor, the executive editor of the New York Times, was a clerk when I came on. He became a reporter, and what do you know? Time passes, he's the boss. And many people came up that way, and I did too. I came up, I wasn't even a clerk. I was a part-time City College reporter for $12 a week.
Who hired you? Do you remember?
Yes, I did. I do. It was certainly not. It was the city editor of the Times in those days. Man, was very professorial type. And I was a kid at City College, and I got $12 for reporting about the college, and one day I got a job on the staff.
Now, the fact that you were Jewish had no detrimental effect?
No, the only thing that happened to me because I was Jewish is I didn't get my first name in the paper. I became...
A.M.?
Yeah, well, when I was born in Canada, my father, Harry, did not turn to my mother and say, Sarah, let's call him A.M. I was, I was called Abraham. Abraham. My middle name was Michael, after an maternal uncle. But I was always known as Abraham. But in those days, at times not anti-Semitic, but they had some, and that was not the ownership of the paper, because I looked into that, and it was not the non-Jewish editors of whom there were most. They used to say at times the paper owned by Jews, edited by Catholics for Protestants.
Right.
But it was some Jewish editors were self-conscious about the name Abraham. So all the Abrahams on the paper, long before me, underwent a second circumcision. They were initialized.
Was that offensive to you?
Yes, but that was that wasn't not as offended as I became later. I wanted the byline, if it was A.M. or Abe or Abraham or Avram or anything I wanted.
Avram.
The name Abraham somehow froze them, although they didn't freeze them toward Jews or toward me. They were always very nice to me, and I had a good career there. People had their sensitivities that comes from Jewish self-consciousness, which I try to avoid.
Were you given a tremendous Jewish background when you grew up?
No.
Nothing? Huh?
No. My father...
Were you bar mitzvahed, Abe?
What?
Were you bar mitzvahed?
Yes, I was bar mitzvahed. I had a very nice bar mitzvah 5 years ago.
Where, at the wall? In Israel?
No, right here.
Really?
I was never bar mitzvahed. And then I just never bar mitzvahed. For a lot of... Just was not. My father died when I was 12. My mother had great sorrows. Anyway, I was not bar mitzvahed.
Were your parents Canadian citizens? Were they natural citizens? Or
No, they came from Russia to a little town in the Ontario called the Sault Ste. Marie. And my father sent for my mother. They lived in a little town called Beroysk in Belarus. Now then wiped out by the Germans, and wrote her loving letters, and she came across, and they settled in Canada, where I had 5 sisters, and then I was the 6th in the family, and I was born in Canada.
Did your parents speak Yiddish?
To each other, but my mother didn't speak English well, my father did.
Du weißt ein bisschen Yiddish?
Ein bisschen.
Verstehst du das? Where can you say this except on this show, you know? Talk about Yiddish and no, because your background is so strong now for Israel today that people are curious about you.
Well,
you know,
I'm curious myself about that. They're curious about me because most of the people don't understand, including President Carter and head of the CIA to whom I talked. He said to me, gee, you changed your opinion since you began writing a column. And I said, you mean because I don't write like the editorials I used to write? And he said, yes. I said, you know, you've been head of the CIA for 10 years and you don't know a fool. That was a little stronger a thing about how the Times operates. The executive editor of the New York Times had nothing to do with it. So they assumed that I agreed with the whatever editorial page it was. And I had my own opinions, which then I started, and as a reporter, and an editor, news editor, executive editor, I didn't really express opinions because that was my job, was to make the Times non-political. And if I was shooting my mouth off all the time, so would everybody else. And when I began writing under my name, my opinions as a column, I expressed what I felt. And I had never been involved in anything to do really with Israel, except I was emotionally for it as a Jew, or I would have been as a non-Jew. But my career as I was a foreign correspondent most of the time. It took me to Eastern Europe, India, Japan. I really never had anything to do with it.
Right. I
never ever belonged to a Jewish organization of any kind. But as I began writing a column on anything I wanted to write, certain things that were in me moved up to the forefront. Not because they were suppressed, it was because they were sublimated by my job as the executive editor. Human rights, a lot of other things. And one of them was Israel. And my major interest in Israel then and now is the security of Israel. I am not really enamored of either of the parties, Labor or Likud, or the coalitions. That's putting it very politely. I think the Israeli government system where the cabinet ministers blackmail the prime minister and they trade off ministers is disgraceful.
Did you think it would change with the new law?
Well, I thought it certainly hasn't.
It's worse, I can tell you.
It's abominable.
It's the worst of both worlds.
The Prime Minister of Israel doesn't get to appoint his own ambassador to the United States without the approval, and sometimes he doesn't approve of the foreign minister.
And the converse is true. If you don't like what he's doing, you're stuck with him for 4 years. You can't throw him out. You need 61 in the Knesset.
Well, it's really it's fragmented.
It's the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, well. So you can say I'm not interested in trading in the Israeli system for the American, but I am interested in the security of Israel. Eventually they have to, I'm not all along, they make their own decisions, but if I have something what I really want to write about is this whole question of the survival of Israel in the neighborhood of people who are not terribly eager for it to survive. It's been doing it for 50 years. I imagine it'll have to go on another 50 years. Maybe not. I mean, in this situation. But that's what interests me about it. That's where I feel that's what I write about, really. The security of Israel, both militarily and socially, in terms of hatred against it, and so on.
How often do you go to Israel, Abe?
Well, I haven't been a couple of years. Usually I go a few times a year, twice a year. I'm not a regular visitor.
And you meet all the political figures when you go over there?
Yeah.
So it's mainly business. It's not.
It's almost always business.
It's not relaxation.
No,
it's tough to relax
Israel is not a relaxing country anyway. At least to me, it's not I don't find myself oppressed or anything. I wouldn't go there. But when I go travel, I usually write. Not all. When I travel and don't write, I can relax, but it's boring. When I travel, it's an option. You can either be bored and relaxed, or not bored and not relaxed. That's what I pick. Right. I haven't been relaxed in 70 years.
I can get you a suite in the Gaza near Arafat.
Thanks a lot.
You got a beautiful sea out there. Have you been to the Gaza?
Yeah, I've been to the Gaza, and I felt when I went there, the first time, God knows.
When was that?
I don't know, 10 years ago, I guess.
Terrible place.
I thought it was a disgrace. A disgrace to the Arab states for not having helped them. Disgrace to Israel for really being in charge of a place like that. It was very painful.
Have you ever met with Arafat?
No, I have never met with him.
The New York Times, as a lot of newspapers do, has an editorial board, and they usually invite political leaders to come in and visit with them. How important are those meetings?
Well, they are important. I think they're important for the Times, in that that these leaders come and see us. And we only have one head apiece, which is interesting. They're interesting to us because they're off the record. I think they really might as well be on the record. Because people of any consequence do not say anything off the record that they wouldn't see on the record or background. However, the tradition is off the record, and most of the time it is. Occasionally they say interesting things. Not always. And I'll tell you one of the most interesting insights. This was at the time of Nasser, and I was just a managing editor or something. And Abba Eban was the guest. And some people at the table were just talking about their visit to Nasser. And what Nasser had told him, that, how much he likes, he really wants to make peace with Israel, and what a, gentle fellow, whatever he said. I don't want to be too sarcastic, but, that he really liked Jews, and he liked this, and he liked that. And they thought that was important. And as a matter of fact, they had a right to, because I'm kind of mocking the conversation. I don't mean to. There were two serious guys having a serious conversation with Nasser, two Americans, and they were impressed by what he said and his goodwill. Abba Eban at that time said to them, he said, well, that's interesting, but frankly, I'm not interested in what he said to you in English. I'm only interested what Nasser says in Arabic to his own people.
Interesting.
That's what. And later I wrote a piece telling that little story and saying the same thing about Arafat.
You're saying it today in your column. We're taping on a Tuesday. You're saying it about Arafat today.
Yeah.
When he talks in Arabic, he's calling for holy wars, jihads, etc., etc. When he talks in English, it's a different lexicon. And you quote Nicholas Burns today.
Yeah.
He's saying that he thinks everything is
well.
Okay.
What I'm disturbed by is two things. One is I don't think that Arafat has carried out any of his promises under the Oslo and Hebron agreement.
Well, let me ask you one question.
What?
Are you in favor of the Oslo agreement?
I was not when it was made.
Right.
I was very critical of it.
Right.
Because I thought that it would endanger Israeli security, and I thought that even Mr. Rabin was saying things that, and Rabin particularly, truth be told, was saying things for which he had stood against before the election.
You're 100% right, and I'll tell you why. Because I was one of the first people to meet Arafat for the Israelis, and I needed to, in a sense, get a sort of a moral clearance from Yitzhak Rabin, because I had represented from time to go over to Tunis to see him. And he said to me, you can go because you're an American, but you're wasting your time. I don't believe in him. He represents nobody, he has no authority, and it's a waste of time. 4 years, and I come back and I meet him, and he says, yeah, I don't want to know about him. He's nothing. He really wiped him out. 4 years later, or 7 years later, I'm on the White House lawn, and he's shaking his hand.
Yeah.
And reluctantly. I mean, you remember that handshake.
Well, I feel that the agreement as signed and as intended by the Labour Party, including Mr. Rabin when he decided to accept it, was a reversal of what Mr. Rabin had stood for before.
Absolutely.
A reversal of the accepted military belief in the United States, among our own chiefs of staff, the territory was important to the defense of Israel, and specifically a reversal of what the present head of Labor, former General Barak, was saying at that time too. Okay.
Right.
So I wasn't really in favor of it at all, really. I thought it just gave that they were heading toward giving away all the territories that Israel had taken or had been won in wars against Israel for 50 years, and I thought that was kind of dangerous. And until that time, I was fortified by Mr. Rabin before the election. I was fortified by Barak. I was fortified by what the chiefs of staff said. I'm not a military genius, hardly, but that's what I believed, and I thought that Oslo, when it came about, was unraveling that, and I think it would have. I think there's an interesting thing that's happened going on in the Middle East, particularly. It was really not seen very clearly. The only person who has shown any flexibility is...
Hold on 1 minute, Abe. We're going to take a break.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high. To have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Get the book that inspired the award-winning movie, Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels. Learn about the Backdoor Channel negotiations that led to the historic 1978 Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Become a witness to history and order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Also available at all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at iTunes or Audible.com. Relive history. Order Backdoor Channels.
We're back. We're speaking with A.M. Rosenthal, the former managing editor of the New York Times, and he changed his name didn't change it. He got the second birth from Abraham to AM, and he is a vociferous person and voice for Israel security. And he writes about how many columns do you write about Israel? You write 3 times a week, Abe?
No, I write twice a week. I don't count them. You know what a Jew counter is?
No.
Okay, a Jew counter is a Jew who counts how many Jews there are in a specific how many Jews there are in the New York Times.
Okay, I got you.
But it's usually a Jew. So I don't count Jews, and I don't count how many columns there are in Israel. I don't mean to be offensive.
No, but that's at the forefront of your mind. Israel security.
I wite as much as I feel I should.
I mean, you're known. I can tell you that Israel,
I write quite a bit.
I'm sure. I don't know how they probably send you right over to Israel because everybody knows about your columns. I mean, you're really famous over there.
Well, I write quite a bit about it. Sometimes I say, well, don't write so much. There are other topics in the world, and I do. So I try to keep a balance, but it's a balance among things that interest me. So there is a number of things that interest me, and it's a balance among them, not a balance among things that don't interest me. Because if you write about what doesn't interest you, you write with a pallid piece, a meaningless one.
All right, you were explaining to me about Oslo and how you were against it.
Well, you asked me whether or not, what I was saying was that it's an interesting thing, seems to me, that of all the people involved in this, the only one who has shown any flexibility, strategic flexibility. Right. I'm not talking about day-to-day or whether he's a great manager, which he doesn't seem to be at all, but his conceptual flexibility, which is much more important. The only one who's changed at all has been Netanyahu. Labor still wants what it always wanted, was the Oslo agreement, under which and almost total ceding of the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights to the Arab countries on the belief that they were not so necessary for its security anymore. I don't know why. The Likud, particularly Netanyahu, had an entirely different approach, was no ceding of territory to the Palestinians on the West Bank, or almost none. Mr. Netanyahu had that position when he came to office, very carefully, and taking his time and explaining it, and what he was doing, and why, more or less. He accepted land for peace, which had not been the Likud position. That was quite an astonishing
Also gave up Hebron.
Well, that came late, yes. But with the giving up of land, accepting of land for peace, he also gave up Hebron, which the Labour Party could never do. They make the decision to do it.
Right.
I was about to say they didn't have the guts to do it, but I don't really mean they were cowards.
Well, he deferred it. Shimon Peres deferred it.
Right. He deferred it until after election.
Right.
Okay. So, Netanyahu accepted the idea of land for peace. Now, in that sense, he accepted a major part of the thesis of Oslo. What made it more acceptable to me, and I assume to people who feel as I do, is that he did not accept that he had conditions attached to it. Land for peace, but how much land? And he was willing to fight for what he felt was the sufficient land, to keep sufficient land in the West Bank to protect what he and others had always felt was the necessary security of Israel. That was a big decision. But I think that he's not given credit for that.
All right, Abe, what many people will say is maybe Netanyahu is a poll taker. And if you divide Israel, you'll find extreme on the left and extreme on the right, and he's going for the center, sort of like Clinton did. And the poll, basically Israelis want peace. You know that. If you take a poll tomorrow, you'll see 60% of them want peace.
Well, there have to be idiots not to want.
All right, but he's got a tough road there because he's got the Haredi parties, the religious parties, he's got the Russians, and he's got a tough... So you're right. He did take his road, whether it was...
No, it was more than that. He knew that either he had to take... He could not stand pat. If he stood pat, there would be no negotiations.
Right.
So he didn't stand pat.
Right.
The Labour Party did. Arafat did, wisely, because he was going to get everything he wanted under Labour. And he wasn't about to give that up just because Mr. Netanyahu wanted to. The United States was totally in favor of the Oslo Agreement. And it's interesting that the people doing the negotiation are the same people who have been doing it under Bush-Baker,
Right.
and under a term, administration and a half almost
Clinton.
of Clinton. That's
Dennis
8 years.
Ross,
They
yeah.
have. They are committed to, I would imagine, emotionally and politically, and as far as their careers or their vision of themselves, to Oslo. They've have to deal now with a man who is not committed to their vision of Oslo, but to his own.
Right.
And
I think you're right on that, and I think it's a mistake.
I
think
do
you
too,
got-
frankly.
I think like Dennis Ross, who's done a good job, a commendable job. You wear out. I've been involved in processes in the Middle East. You wear out, and you get. First of all, what happens is you want to relate to history. You want to catch that chance in history. Christopher wanted to do it. He was running to the Middle East more than I was going to the New York Times. And you got to stand back a little bit and take a look at what's going on, and you can't keep muddling around that.
I think there develops a point where you become, if you're a human being, committed to something you've worked for.
That's
What they
right.
have worked
Absolutely.
for was the
Right.
surrender of the West Bank and the rest of it to the Palestinians. All of it. All of it. They're not going to get that. That's not. That doesn't. And it's going to be much harder. And that doesn't make them admire, love Netanyahu any the more. I'm not really questioning their honesty. It's just a matter of fact that if you fight for something for 8 years, a certain thing, and then they wanted Perez to win, he didn't win.
You're absolutely correct.
Okay.
It's human nature,
Yeah.
period. And if you're
Right.
committed to it, you want to see it fulfilled.
Right.
You want to write a book, you want to finish your book.
Absolutely.
This is their book. And I
Absolute part
totally
of it.
agree with you. Now, I was in Madrid when Shamir was prime minister, and Netanyahu was a spokesman. And you remember that, he convened all the
Yeah.
Arab nations together. But Shamir, you got to give him a lot of credit. He stands pat. Now, I interviewed Shamir about Oslo. He said to me, it's a terrible agreement, and you got to avoid it. I said, can you avoid an international agreement? He says, why not? That was his simple
But
answer.
Netanyahu is not voiding this.
No, I understand
He's
that.
not at all. I mean, I think.
How far can he go, though, Abe? How far will the right-wingers, the West Bank settlers, let Netanyahu go? Now,
I really think the critical point is not how is the United States in this, not how far the United States will let him go, but will the United States push him so hard that in the end it breaks his government the way it broke Shamir's government? They were broken, that government, by pressure. And it's a very delicate thing, because if you have such a relationship, an intimate relationship with a huge power, and you're a small power, you simply can't tell it, you ignore it.
You can't do it,
On
period.
the other hand, I think that the pressure of the United States at this point on Netanyahu is misplaced. I think that he will move toward what he was elected for, and whether we like it, the American negotiators like it or not, he was elected by a majority of the Jews who was not, in that sense, a razor kind of election. It was a landslide among the
If
Jews.
you count the Jews, yeah.
Yes, it could.
Without the
Why
Arab
not?
vote.
That doesn't dismiss the Arab vote. You certainly was a very thin victory if you take the whole population.
Right.
And legally you must, and nobody's ever said otherwise. But just as in this city we might say that a Jewish candidate won the Jewish vote, or a black candidate won the black vote, there's nothing shameful of saying that Mr. Netanyahu won the Jewish vote. I mean, it's almost idiotic to pretend that's not true. And the people who voted for him wanted peace, and they wanted his vision, and I wish he would express himself more, his vision of what a secure peace is. Now, Mr. Arafat, who I think is one of the most successful politicians in the whole world, really, and I'm not being funny. That guy
I think
came
you're
from
right.
nothing. Now he has found a government, namely the Labour government, and the people, namely the Israelis, who would give him a state. The Israelis are not only giving him a state, it's already created. They're giving him the money for it, the tax money and grants. So they're giving him the arms for his army.
It's a de facto state.
It's a de facto state, but it's not a de facto state, but it's they created it and made it possible with the presidency, a legislature, arms, and all the rest of it. I mean, that's and the world recognizes him really as the head of a state.
Most of the countries do.
Right, and they will. So he's sitting quite pretty despite all this, all the fuss and all the terrorism, which I think he tacitly encourages. And he is not. There's no reason for him to be reasonable when he can hope and pray for the nullification of the election by the overthrow of Netanyahu, either by the under the pressure of the United States or without it. This is the effort at all times by labor and to a certain extent by American government to, I'm sure they all hope they wake up in the morning and find out that Perez is back and this was all a bad dream, but they won't.
It's not going to happen. I spoke to the White House before I came to the show today, and they told me Dennis Ross is going back with the primary purpose of getting some kind of commitment from Arafat that he will attend to all the security needs that he promised to do under Oslo. Is that a reality? No,
I don't think so. I think that Mr. Arafat will promise to do so again. I mean, he promised at Oslo, he promised at Hebron, he promised every Monday and Thursday, as my mother would say. But I think that if it's the advantage of the Israelis, they could accept his promise for a while, until it's to their advantage to accept it, let's say, for a couple of years, knowing at the end of those 2 years he will break it. But I think that to accept it, assuming that this is what he sees in the long run, is naive. As a matter of fact, I am more optimistic about peace in the short run than in the long run. I think in the short run, in a few years, they may be able to reach some. Arafat will understand that as long as the United States doesn't overthrow Netanyahu by pressure, he'll have to give something to it.
Eric Brindell was on the show last week.
Good guy.
He says the most we can hope for is a cessation of hostilities and not really a peace.
Well, we'll call it that, but we're saying the same thing.
Basically, you are. So we got the New York Post and the New York Times. No, A.M. Rosenthal.
A.M. Rosenthal and Eric Brindell have the same opinion. That's different.
All right, we're going to cut. We'll come right back after a break, and we'll continue with A.M. Rosenthal, which is not only fascinating but historically important, because what he says says a lot to what happens in the Middle East, believe it or not. This young man over here, he's got that power.
No, but man.
Get best-selling author Leon Charney's latest book, The Battle of the Two Talmuds. Join Charney as he explores years of Jewish history to find out why and how Talmudic scholars and rabbis abandoned the Holy Land for the lands of the diaspora. Learn about the power struggles behind the creation of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. It's a book critics call engaging and enlightening, a book which will be of interest to people of every faith. Now available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or download the audiobook of The Battle of the Two Talmuds at iTunes or Audible.com. Leon Charney sets out to discover the true meaning of the Kaddish, the Jewish custom of reciting a prayer to commemorate the death of a close relative. Join Charney as he finds out the history of the Kaddish and how it has evolved. Reviewed as a refreshing walk through Jewish history and a book that deserves to be read by both Jews and non-Jews, The Mystery of the Kaddish is now available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at Audible.com or on iTunes. Discover the mystery of the Kaddish.
We're back with A.M. Rosenthal, who was the executive editor of the New York Times and at one time the managing editor, and he said, you should correct it, I'm only kibitzing. One Jew kibitzes, and he changed his name from Abraham to A.M. I take it seriously, and that's where we stand. The executive editor.
I did not change my name.
No.
You just changed for me.
You initialized it, right? One of the things that annoys a lot of people in this country, and you bring it out in your column, is that Arafat is not only, in a sense, hurting Israel, but hurting Jews. And I think you're the only one who really, in a major newspaper, speaks about it.
What I'm saying is that there are two things going on that I hold Arafat responsible.
For these bombings last week?
No, I hold him responsible not for the bombings, but for the atmosphere, for his tacit approval of the possibility of bombings or any other kind of terror as a legitimate way of expressing disagreement. I do not believe you can express the disagreement with another party by bombing that party, whether it's a person or a country, and then saying, well, it's my right. It's not your right. Okay, so I think but all his jihad, and his praise of Hamas and so on, he is responsible for the atmosphere around it. Otherwise, he shouldn't be president. If he says, I can't help it, he should get somebody who can. It's all controlled, the radio, the newspapers, etc., all controlled by the Palestinian authorities. So that's one thing. The other thing, which I'm writing about, is very troublesome, is that there is, in addition to everything else, there has come up in the last couple of years, or more, there was a pause, an anti-Jewish rhetoric. Now, it's one thing for him to have a rhetoric against the conditions of Oslo or for the conditions. It's another thing for them to have a vicious rhetoric against Jews. I don't say anti-Semitic because they're Semites, so I say anti-Jewish. By that I mean, on his radio, his chief cleric, whom he appointed, the Mufti of Jerusalem, calls the Israelis from the temple, the mosque in Jerusalem. He refers to the Israelis as sons of monkeys and pigs. The Palestinian propaganda puts out stories to the effect that the Israeli army, that the Israelis have injected 300 Arab kids with AIDS, that the Israeli army has a deliberate campaign going on to poison Arabs by putting cancer-inducing food in their... I mean, this is rough stuff.
Terrible.
This is all the blood libels and all the rest of it. And I hate this. Of course I hate it. Anybody would. And I hold him responsible because it was the Arafat minister who said this about AIDS. It was the Arafat radio station and the Arafat newspapers that talk about poisoning children, poisoning adults. It's the Arafat-appointed clerics who talk about sons of monkeys. It's the Arafat radio that talks about how Jews are not really people, they're like animals. I mean, this stuff is very dangerous stuff. We've heard about it. It's a dehumanization of a group, whether it's Serbs or Muslims or Jews, but Jews have suffered more from this. And
Absolutely.
Those Jews who sit around saying, oh, well, he's just talking, are idiots. And those Jews, including American Jews, who say, well, Arafat's not responsible, what can he do? They're also idiots, if you ask. Forgive me, and if you won't, I say so, because these people are appointed by him. He could eliminate them one way or another as he sees fit, certainly disappoint them. I mean, take their appointments away. These are his people. They're not Hamas people.
All right,
They're people that he appoints.
So tell me what you tell a man like Aubrey Eben, who's very much for a Palestinian state with Arafat, Shimon Peres, who's very much for a Palestinian state. He's given them a lot of aid.
They created the Palestinian state.
Right.
Abba and Peres and the Labour Party created the Palestinian state, and I don't know how they're going to change that. I don't think they can. The question then is, I don't tell them anything because they're committed to this, but the question is, what are the conditions under which a Palestinian state will exist? What are the conditions that Israel needs in order to exist in some sense of safety with another Arab state? I think it's possible. What I think is possible, they're not going to get what Labour would have given them, 90% of the West Bank, and they're not going to, but they'll get they already have all the cities, and they'll have to be satisfied with a little less. All the concessions have been made so far by Israel.
All right, tell me, Shimon Peres is a very bright man, a terrific servant for Israel, great career, a patriot, founded the defense ministry, armed it at least, and he was a tremendous man. And you've spoken with him about this. What does he say? I mean, he's a Jew, and he's Israeli, and he's a great diplomat.
He's a Jew.
I know, all right.
He's run risks that I would never have. Of course, but the people are wrong. Some people are wrong, some people are right in a given situation. You have a divided population. It's practically 50-50. It changes all the time. He can't be said to be any wiser than the other 50%. My own opinion, my own belief and instincts are contrary to his. Not contrary. I also believe there can be a peace. I also believe the idea of a Palestinian state doesn't, it's done.
It's a fact. It's a fact. Right.
But I think I think it is foolhardy, really, and people do foolhardy things. That's how wars start and how one side gets defeated by the other.
Right, I'll agree with that.
The Arabs did very foolhardy things. They took on the Israelis once. They took them on twice. They took them on for 50 years, and they lost each time. And each time, somebody made the wrong decisions.
What's your opinion of Camp David?
Well, I think that was the right decision.
Thank God.
I think that was the right decision. I mean, but there too, Israel gave away a huge chunk of land, but they gave it away not with their best friends, because you don't make peace with your best friends that way. But they gave it away first of all, it wasn't that military. They weren't that militarily
Sinai,
important to them,
yeah.
the Sinai. Secondly, they had some confidence in Sadat. And it was a worthwhile gamble that turned out to be pretty good. Just as their relations with Jordan are not bad. In fact, they're very good.
They're very
it's a
helpful.
gamble there, too. But they're doing it. This did not seem to me to be a worthwhile gamble to give up all your security of territory, whatever it brought, which is not perfect, with a people who have really not committed themselves, no matter what to the existence of Israel. They haven't changed their rhetoric, they haven't changed their propaganda, they haven't changed their Arabic, talking in Arabic to Arabs, they haven't changed their personnel to any great degree, they haven't changed anything. And I don't think that it's a sensible gamble.
All right. Give me your insight, if you have some, on Arik Sharon. Is he a person that can really help Bibi lead this fight? People really believe in him. They believe in him as a great general. They believe, especially right-wingers. And you need a leader, by the way, who can convince
well,
people.
like many other people, I have a soft spot for Sharon.
How soft?
Not that soft, but I mean, I'm not a soft spot, not soft-headed.
Right.
I hope. I think he's a very, very, very intelligent guy. I don't know whether he's a great general. I don't know. I don't think that in the end the Lebanese war was redounded greatly to Israel's advantage, let alone to the advantage of the Lebanese who lost so many people. It's not. I don't think. I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so. Okay, but I think that this. I think he wants peace with the Arabs. In fact, I'm positive.
Sure, he does.
And I think that he. He sees himself as Nixon going to China. That kind, of course, Nixon's net result is going to China 20 years later. It was his fault, but it's not the nice little puppy dog it was before.
Right.
But I would have hoped that some way could have been found to put Mr. Sharon in the cabinet, in a job.
You mean the inner cabinet?
Inner cabinet.
Kitchen cabinet.
But there is I think there is obviously no great amity among this group.
No.
And I think that is disgraceful. Here they're sitting as a group of people elected by the people. I blame them, really. I blame them all. Netanyahu, Sharon,
Levy.
all of these. I mean, they have the responsibility for the nation, and they're quarreling all the time. It's a really unpleasant sight.
And the question is, can a government like that, who is quarreling all the time, let's assume that Netanyahu does have a plan. Can he bring it through, and can we get at least an interim peace, as you call it?
I think so. I think it's part of his responsibility, and the others. I mean, don't these guys ever sit around the table and say, what are we doing to this country? We have the legal right to louse it up, the whole system, and to behave like idiots, but do we have to do this? I mean, can't we, aren't we intelligent enough and civilized enough and love Israel enough
Patriotic.
to stop this? I'm sure they'll say, yes, we are. That's why we're doing all this. But it doesn't look that way.
As you said before, not always are those people the best and the brightest to be doing this.
No.
And, politics today does not attract the best and the brightest. And
I like Sharansky, as many of us do, and although it was a rather strong, not so pleasant piece about him in New Yorker this week, or last week. But I'm not. They've got plenty of talent. They don't have a system that is conducive to amity, and they have to make it that way.
All right, I'm going to ask you a question. You may not know the answer. What caused, and if you know, and you may not know, what caused Yitzhak Rabin to make this change?
Well, I don't know the answer. It's only surmise. I know that I spoke to him several days before the election, a week or so. I went to Israel.
The one when he got elected?
Right. Several days before that election, I went to Israel, a week or two before, really for one purpose, to discuss the security situation with the people involved.
Right.
So I had a conversation with Moshe Arens, then the defense minister of the Shamir government, and Shamir there too, but he was the man I talked to most. And then I had it with Mr. Rabin, who was the head of the Labour Party, but not the
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister. And I had it with the then Chief of Staff, now the head of the Labour Party. And I asked them what they felt Israel's defense needs were. And they were so close together they gave me exactly the same answers, that land was important, the Golan Heights was important, and so and so and so and so. As a result of which, I wrote a column, which was totally wrong, as it turned out. It was right as that day, which was that no matter who was elected, Israel would have the same defense problems and would keep the same basic defense strategy. First part was true, the second was wrong. Because afterward, Mr. Rabin changed his mind. He had gone, you know, I can't tell you why he changed his mind. I think he felt that it was a worthwhile risk. He was, I think, an honest man, and he felt it was a worthwhile risk. But the political pressures grew on him. His whole most of his Labor Party wanted it. I remember, and they wanted Mr. Rabin as a shield, mostly. I remember speaking to one man, very top man in the Labor Party, who was a young fellow, headed for places. And I said, gee, I talked about, Mr. Rabin doesn't agree. He was a big dove, this guy. I said, Mr. Rabin doesn't seem that way. He still thinks land is important. I just talked to him. It was all on the record. And he smiled and he said, well, let me tell you something. We are the rocket. The Rabin is our propellant. He'll put us up and we'll dump him. Now,
all right, Abe, we're going to cut for a break, and we'll come back and talk about a very easy topic called Jerusalem and Har Chomah, and whether Har Chomah had anything to do with what happened in the last 2 weeks. And don't leave us. We'll be right back.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high. To have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Get the book that inspired the award-winning movie, Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels. Learn about the Backdoor Channel negotiations that led to the historic 1978 Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Become a witness to history and order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Also available at all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at iTunes or Audible.com. Relive history. Order Backdoor Channels.
We're back. We're with A.M. Rosenthal, the executive editor, former executive editor of the New York Times, former Avram. His name was Avram Abraham, and then A.M. He, what they call it, initialized it because the editor at that time thought Jews would look better with A.M.s rather than Abrahams. Anyway,
I'm now a columnist.
He's a scholar on the Middle East, and if not a scholar, he has strong opinions. Strong opinions. Okay. Jerusalem. The eternal homeland, the eternal capital of the Jews. Is that ever going to be settled in an amicable way?
I think it can be.
Really?
Yeah, sure. I think it can be. Again, I'm not so wildly optimistic as you may, but I think it can be. I don't think that it can be settled as the Arabs wanted to be settled as the Palestinians, that will be the capital of Palestine, and no other country will have it as a capital. I don't think that will ever happen. I do think it is possible that the Israelis and the Palestinians can make arrangements on who has control over the temples,
religious sites,
that there could be an area outside Jerusalem, maybe bordering on it, maybe not so carefully surveyed,
where they can have a capital.
Where they could have government buildings and where they fly their flag.
Sadat told me personally, Sadat, you remember him, told me all I care about is a flag and a post office.
That's right.
That's all he told me.
Well, I think it's possible to give them that. I don't think it's possible for the Israelis to withdraw from their capital and they're whistling Dixie, whatever they call it.
This fellow, this Jewish fellow, Moskowitz, who bought land in Jerusalem and then he wanted to put up some buildings. Your opinion, should he, Netanyahu stopped him, Omar, the mayor of Jerusalem, let him go forward. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a more important question, and that is a previous question, which is whether or not the Israelis had a right to put up houses for Jews.
Har Homa?
Yeah, Har Homa, and I think they did. I think to tell a sovereign country that it cannot build a nation, a building in its own is ridiculous. That does not prevent the Prime Minister of Israel, who has responsibility for war and peace, for saying, I'm building this one, but I showed my strength, I showed what my principle, I'm not going to do it every other day, so I don't want to build that one. And I think he's justified in doing that. I don't know anything about the Dr. Moskowitz. I don't know anything about him. I think he has a right to invest if he's investing merely only to show the principle. I really think that that principle is up to the Israelis to show and not foreigners.
For an American,
no.
yeah. A lot of people agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think Netanyahu did the right thing by stopping him at that point.
I think he did the right thing in the first place. I mean, by permitting the building. Yeah, I think he might have done it. You know, you can second guess anybody to death. Having been an editor, I was always second guessed. I second guessed other people.
One of your close friends, Henry Kissinger, was a very, very close friend of Yitzhak Rabin.
Mm-hmm.
Every time Yitzhak Rabin came to this country, he would always meet with Henry Kissinger and take a helicopter up, I think, to Connecticut. I was with him on a few of those. Yeah. What does Kissinger think about the Middle East at this point?
Well, I think on that subject, although Kissinger has made his opinions very clear in what he's written, and he's been quite forthright about it, in fact warning the Israelis not to take too many risks. He's not a man who automatically will trust a hostile enemy, and I think he's been quite strong on this. The last I talked to him about, the last I read about from him, that had not changed. He avoids, you know, he is a diplomat, and he is a statesman. He wants to be one to the rest of his life. He probably will be. We are going to agree on many things. We just don't talk about China, because now we're so far apart.
Europe for Human Rights?
Yeah, and sometimes we meet, and I really like him.
By the way, as a collateral issue, Peter Vallone, the city council president, was on the show and told me, and on the show, that you motivated him to do something about Christian persecution around the world.
Well, that makes me very proud. It's an issue, I think, that too little attention has been paid to by Christians themselves in China and the Arab world, and not enough by Jews either. And I feel that this is an area where Jews and Christians really ought to. The major responsibility is Christians, just as the major responsibility for getting the Jews out of Russia. Soviet Union was Jewish, and they did, but the Jews looked to Christians for help and got it, and did not make them pass any litmus tests. So what kind of a Christian are you? Are you a left or right? Are you for abortion or against abortion? You know, or are you for school aid or not to procure school aid? Nobody asked those questions, and I think that was correct. When you have the job of rescuing people from torment, and you ask for help, that's what counts, as long as they're not bigots or anything, which they wouldn't be anyway. So I think that that Christians. I'm very proud of my whole career as a journalist, about 800 years now. I have really feel I've had not often as much effect and not often as much emotional involvement as in this, not never, but not much, not many, as this writing about the persecution of Christians in China, other communist countries, and in the Muslim world.
Well, I think he's going to boycott economically as best
he can.
He's
shown a great deal of bravery.
Well, he did it with the Swiss bank accounts.
Yeah, and I know that and I get so many letters on this subject of such warmth and tenderness is the only way, and love is the only, that I really am very moved by it. And they come from lay people, Christians. They come from bishops, cardinals in this country, abroad, and so on, from just people. And I think that that there will never be a real human rights grass movement in the United States unless more secular people like myself. I always wrote about human rights for 10 years. Well, I suddenly realized I was writing about political and press human rights, that kind of thing, which is very important.
You should be in love with Jimmy Carter. That was his whole policy.
Of what?
For human rights.
Yes, and he made human rights a very important thing.
Right.
But I realized that I was not writing about the religious human rights in the world. And that in this country and other countries, religion is very important. And people will be moved, and the only possibility, that's not why I did it. I was once walking down 7th Avenue, going to lunch with my wife, and the east side, we passed through the Diamond Center, which is Jewish, largely Jewish. I've been writing about Christians' persecution. The guy comes up to me, he was obviously an Orthodox Jew by the way he dressed, and he said, he didn't know me, he saw me. He said, "You Rosenthal?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Why are you writing so much about Christians?" So I said, "Well, you see, there are the Christians, they're being persecuted." He said, "Never mind." He said, "You're writing about them because you think it'll be good for Jews, right?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Go ahead, never mind." He walked away. Keep writing. That's all he's interested in. Yes, it'll be good for Jews, but that's not why I'm writing. It'll be good for everybody.
What's a Jew to you?
Huh?
What's a Jew to you?
How many hours do you have?
We got 2 minutes.
Well, I'm not a...
You know, I asked a question. It's very interesting to me that the tender age of 39, you came back and had yourself a bar mitzvah. So something... 39, yeah. Something spurred it.
I had a bar mitzvah when I was 70 years old.
70.
Right.
And what is a Jew to you? Is it, or is it too long to get into?
It is. Well, I mean, a Jew is somebody who... I really believe, you see, I'm not a religious Jew. I'm not an atheist, but I'm not a religious Jew. My father was not. My grandfather was. Maybe that's why my father wasn't. But
that's right. That's the story.
But a Jew is somebody who believes in God, a Jewish God, whatever that is, and who considers himself part of Jewishness and the Jewish community. Now, I wasn't. I said I was once told my wife I was going to have for various reasons a bar mitzvah, and then I decided not to do it. By that time, of course, I called somebody called a rabbi, and I said to this young rabbi, they were all young, "Look, I'm not going to go through with this. It's, I can't do this because I haven't got time. You know, I haven't got time." So he said, "Okay," but he didn't argue. He was at Central Synagogue. He said, "But you know what a bar mitzvah is?" And I said, "Well, you tell me." He said, "Well, a bar mitzvah is the announcement, commitment that by a Jew,
10 seconds now.
that a Jew will support and help the Jewish community." And I said, "Well, I try to do that anyway, so we might as well have it."
Am, pleasure. It's really, his name is Abraham. You come back. We're going to discuss the Middle East. It's everlasting. We'll see you next week. We're out of time.